There's a pattern some people repeat their entire lives without ever naming it. They build something, a career, a relationship, a routine, and just when it starts to feel stable, they want to burn it down and begin again. It's not restlessness. It's not impulsiveness. It's not even dissatisfaction with what they've created. From the outside, their life might look enviable, successful even, but inside there's this persistent pull toward elsewhere, toward different, toward new. And the strangest part is that no matter how many times they start over, the feeling never quite goes away. Maybe the problem isn't what they're building. Maybe it's that they've never learned how to stay. That's the paradox of always wanting to start over. It looks like courage, like someone brave enough to reinvent themselves repeatedly. And sometimes it is, but other times it's something else entirely. It's a pattern of leaving before you can be left. It's abandoning things before they have a chance to disappoint you. It's confusing motion with progress, believing that if you just find the right place, the right person, the right version of yourself, everything will finally click into place. Psychologists have long studied what they call avoidant commitment patterns, the tendency to disengage from situations once they require sustained effort or emotional depth. It's not about lacking ambition. People who constantly restart are often highly capable, driven even. But somewhere beneath the surface there's a discomfort with permanence, with roots, with the vulnerability that comes from staying long enough to be truly known. And here's what makes it so confusing. These aren't people who fail. They often succeed at what they start. They get the job, build the relationship, create the life. But then, right when things should feel satisfying, something shifts. A quiet voice begins whispering that maybe this isn't it. Maybe there's something better elsewhere. Maybe they made a mistake. And that voice, once it starts, becomes impossible to ignore. This pattern often begins in environments where staying meant enduring something uncomfortable. Maybe childhood felt unpredictable or emotionally unsafe. Maybe early relationships taught them that commitment meant losing yourself. Maybe the message, spoken or unspoken, was that loyalty was a trap. Children absorb these lessons without language. They learn that leaving is safer than staying, that starting over means control, that reinvention protects you from being stuck. Attachment researchers describe this as a disruption in secure base formation. When early environments don't provide safety, the mind learns to create its own sense of security through mobility. If nothing is permanent, nothing can hurt you. If you're always ready to leave, you're never truly vulnerable. And over time, that readiness becomes identity. You become someone who doesn't settle, who doesn't get stuck, who always has an exit plan. The result is an adult who moves through life like they're perpetually apartment hunting. Everything feels temporary. Even good things feel like they're just marking time until the next chapter. And while this creates a sense of freedom, it also creates a deeper kind of loneliness. Because no matter where you go, you're always carrying the same restlessness with you. What's particularly isolating about this experience is how difficult it is to explain. How do you tell someone you want to leave a good situation? How do you describe the feeling of being somewhere that works but still doesn't feel right? Most people don't understand it. They see the external circumstances, the good job, the stable relationship, and they wonder what's wrong with you. Why can't you just be grateful? Why can't you just stay? But that's exactly the question you're asking yourself. And the lack of a clear answer only makes the restlessness worse. Because if you can't identify what's wrong, you can't fix it. So you convince yourself it must be the situation. It must be the job, the city, the relationship. If you just change the external circumstances, the internal feeling will resolve. And so you start over, again. There's a particular rush that comes with starting fresh. New possibilities, clean slate, the excitement of building something from nothing. For people who crave this feeling, starting over becomes addictive. Not in the dramatic sense, but in the way the brain learns to associate newness with relief. The novelty hijacks the discomfort. For a while, everything feels manageable again. Hopeful, light. Neuroscience offers some insight into why this happens. The brain's reward system responds powerfully to novelty. New experiences trigger dopamine release, creating feelings of excitement and motivation. But here's the catch, that dopamine surge is temporary. Once the newness wears off, once things become familiar again, the brain returns to its baseline. And if that baseline includes chronic restlessness, the cycle repeats. This is why people who constantly start over often describe a pattern. The beginning is thrilling, the middle becomes mundane, and the end feels suffocating. They're not actually responding to the situation deteriorating, they're responding to the absence of novelty. The brain has learned to interpret familiarity as stagnation, and stagnation feels like death. And here's where it gets more complex. This pattern often coexists with high achievement. These aren't people who've given up on life. They're often ambitious, creative, capable. They build impressive careers by jumping between opportunities. They cultivate interesting lives by constantly exploring. From the outside, they seem dynamic, adaptable, brave, but internally, they're exhausted. Because constantly starting over means never building depth, never accumulating the kind of growth that comes from staying through difficulty. Jung wrote about what he called the eternal youth archetype, the part of the psyche that resists maturation, that wants to preserve infinite possibility by refusing to commit to any single path. He argued that while this archetype contains valuable qualities like spontaneity and imagination, when it dominates, it prevents the person from ever truly individuating, from becoming whole. They remain perpetually on the verge of their life without ever fully entering it. For people who always want to start over, the eternal youth has become totalizing. They've preserved their options at the cost of their depth. They can do anything, which paradoxically means they struggle to commit to anything. And that freedom, which once felt liberating, eventually becomes its own kind of prison. Because you can't build anything meaningful without sustained presence. You can't develop mastery without repetition. You can't form deep bonds without consistency. And the exhaustion of this is profound, even if they don't always recognize it. Constantly. Starting over requires enormous energy. Learning new systems, building new relationships, proving yourself repeatedly, never accumulating the ease that comes from familiarity, never having the luxury of autopilot. Every transition demands full presence, full effort, full adaptation. And while that keeps life interesting, it also means you never get to rest. This chronic activation often manifests in subtle ways: difficulty sleeping, persistent low-level anxiety, a feeling of being perpetually behind even when you're ahead. The body knows what the mind won't admit, that you're running. Not towards something, but away from the discomfort of staying, away from the vulnerability of being known, away from whatever pain or disappointment you've convinced yourself will catch up if you stop moving. What's particularly painful is that this pattern often goes unrecognized by the person living it. Because each new start feels justified. The last job wasn't quite right. The last city didn't feel like home. The last relationship wasn't the one. And maybe those statements are even true. But when the pattern repeats 5, 10, 15 times, at some point the common denominator isn't the circumstances, it's you. Breaking this cycle requires something most people find terrifying: staying. Not just physically, but emotionally. Staying when it gets boring, staying when it gets difficult, staying when the novelty fades and you're left with the ordinary reality of building something real. Because that ordinariness, that routine, that familiarity you've been running from, that's actually where depth lives. That's where transformation happens. Not in the excitement of beginning, but in the unglamorous middle. But here's the paradox. The very thing that feels most dangerous, commitment, is often what creates the possibility of genuine freedom. Because as long as you're managing your escape routes, you're not fully present. You're holding back. You're keeping one foot out the door. And that self-protection prevents the kind of authentic engagement that makes life feel meaningful. This doesn't mean staying in genuinely wrong situations. Some things should end. Some places aren't right. Some relationships are toxic. But when you always want to start over, you lose the ability to distinguish between situations that need changing and the discomfort that comes from growth. Everything uncomfortable starts to feel like a sign to leave, and that interpretation keeps you trapped in the cycle. For many, this process begins with simply noticing the pattern, recognizing that you've been here before, that this feeling of wanting to leave is familiar, that maybe it's not about this specific job or relationship, but about something deeper, something internal. Just noticing without judgment, without immediately acting on it. Just seeing that the impulse to start over has become automatic. Because awareness alone begins to create space. When you can observe the pattern, you're no longer completely identified with it. There's a you that notices the urge to leave, which means there's a you that exists separate from the urge. And that's the beginning of choice. Not dramatic transformation, just the first small step toward understanding that starting over is something you do to manage discomfort, not something that happens to you. From there, the work is gradual. It's about building tolerance for stability, for routine, for the feeling of being in one place long enough to actually know it. Starting small, maybe staying in a job past the point where it feels exciting, maybe remaining in a relationship when the honeymoon phase ends, maybe living in a city long enough to see the seasons change twice. Small commitments that teach your nervous system that staying is survivable. This is not easy work, because every time you practice staying, you're working against years of conditioning that says leaving is safer. Your mind will generate reasons to go. It will find flaws in your situation. It will paint elsewhere as paradise. But if you can stay with it, even briefly, you begin to teach yourself that discomfort doesn't always mean wrong. That boredom doesn't always mean dead. That familiarity can be the foundation for something deeper. What often surprises people in this process is discovering what's been driving the restlessness all along. Usually, it's not about the external circumstances at all. It's about avoiding some internal reality. Maybe it's fear of inadequacy, the worry that if you stay long enough, people will see you're not as capable as they thought. Maybe it's fear of ordinariness, the belief that a predictable life means you failed. Maybe it's unprocessed grief, pain from the past that surfaces when things get quiet enough to feel it. There's also shame in this recognition. Shame at how many times you've left. Shame at the relationships you've abandoned, the opportunities you've discarded, the life you could have built if you just stayed. That shame deserves acknowledgement. It's real. But it's also not the whole story. Because leaving was protection. It kept you safe when staying felt dangerous. And understanding that doesn't erase the consequences, but it does create compassion. Because that's what this is really about. Not punishing yourself for the pattern, but understanding it deeply enough to choose differently. The impulse to start over isn't character flaw, it's an adaptation. And like any adaptation that was once protective, it can be examined, honoured for what it provided, and gradually released when it no longer serves. And slowly, as you practice staying, something shifts. The restlessness doesn't disappear entirely, but it loses its urgency. You start to recognise it as an old pattern rather than absolute truth. You develop the ability to feel the urge to leave without immediately acting on it. And in that space between impulse and action, you discover something unexpected, that staying doesn't trap you, it grounds you. Those moments don't erase the history, they don't solve everything, but they remind you that depth is possible, that building something over time, accumulating years in one place, growing roots that go deeper than novelty, that's its own kind of freedom. Not the freedom to go anywhere, but the freedom to truly be somewhere. And maybe, quietly, that's what you've been looking for all along. Not the next place, but permission to stop searching and finally arrive.